My name is Edgar Mannheimer, and this is Kalam, a podcast about the Middle East.
Every Palestinian is occupied by Palestine. We always talk about Palestine being occupied. Actually, what I suffer from most is Palestine occupying me. We have been occupied, and I wish to liberate myself from Palestine in the sense of just live an hour in my life when I don't think of myself as a Palestinian.
The voice you just heard was today's guest, Suad Amiry, who we'll be getting back to in just a minute. But first, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Edgar Mannheimer, and I've been a radio journalist for the past 10 years. And this is Kalam, a podcast by myself and my brilliant team of researchers and producers. Kalam is Arabic for talk or discussion. Simply put, I want to talk to interesting people about the culture, history, and politics of the Arab world and the Middle East more broadly. And at this point, you may be wondering, why me? I'm from Sweden, but I grew up in Egypt and Jordan, and I speak fluent Arabic. I went to high school in the Jordanian capital Amman, and because the majority of Jordan's population are Palestinians displaced during 1948, all my closest childhood friends are Palestinian. And I consider it an honor to know that at least some of them are listening right now. I spent several years as an adult living in Cairo, working as a freelance journalist. The connections, both personal and professional, I've made over the years have provided me with an invaluable well of insight and love. And while I usually cringe at the overuse of identity politics, it would be silly of me not to mention the fact that my family name, Mannheimer, is a Jewish one. My upbringing was steeped in Jewish culture, and I have a large extended Jewish family in Sweden. The combination of my Jewish family background and the Arab culture I grew up within has allowed me to truly embrace different and often contradictory perspectives. It's because of this that I think I'm uniquely suited to host this podcast, and I say that with all humility. There's no coincidence that I chose to launch this podcast in the middle of one of the bloodiest catastrophes the Middle East has seen in decades. Israel's war in Gaza, following the October 7 attack, has now claimed over 30,000 Palestinian lives, nearly half of them children. I think understanding the Middle East has never been more important, and it's why I've dedicated the first series of the podcast to exploring the history of Palestine. I hope this podcast turns out to be a source of knowledge and understanding, and if you haven't stopped listening yet, I thank you. Now, on to the show.
والآن في الماضي أضيء لحاضري غده فينأى بي زماني عن مكاني حينا وينأى بي مكاني عن زماني والأنبياء جميعهم أهلي ولكن السماء بعيدة عن أرضها وأنا بعيد عن كلامي.
I illuminate tomorrow's present in the moment. Time separates me from my place. My place separates me from my time. All the prophets are my kin, but heaven is still far from its earth, and I am still far from my words. That was an excerpt from Mahmoud Darwish's poem On a Canaanite Stone at the Dead Sea from 1992. Mahmoud Darwish, who died in 2008, was widely regarded as Palestine's national poet. The stanza you just heard evokes a sense of historical disruption, as it refers to the violent displacement of Palestinians from their homeland in 1948. Many of the descendants of those displaced are languishing in refugee camps in Gaza today. In this episode, the award-winning Palestinian author and architect Suad Amiry is going to help us understand the Nakba. She's written several novels, including the much-praised Sharon and My Mother-in-Law, written in 2005 about the tragicomic reality of being forced to live with her husband's 91-year-old mother because of a curfew imposed by the Israelis. Her latest novel, Mother of Strangers, was given the NPR Books We Love Award in 2022. Set between 1947 and 1951, it's a true story about the fate of several Palestinians, Christians, Jews, and Muslims alike, as the horrors of the Nakba descend upon the port city of Jaffa, Suad's own hometown. Suad al-Amiry is also the founder of Riwaq, the Palestinian Center for Architectural Conservation. Riwaq aims to conserve and revitalize what remains of the rural architectural heritage of historical Palestine, most of which was entirely destroyed in 1948. But before we welcome Suad al-Amiry to the show, I'm going to do my best to summarize the events of the Nakba as briefly as possible to give my conversation with Suad some historical foundations. At the end of the First World War, the British Empire had made a promise to assist in the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Why? There's a lot to be said about what they thought of Jews. In short, it was weird. Sort of like American Christian evangelicals today. They supported a Jewish homeland for largely anti-Semitic reasons. But the most important reason was strategic. It would greatly benefit the British Empire to establish a friendly European colony in a region it wanted to influence and, if possible, dominate. Frankly, I don't believe the British supported the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine simply because they liked Jews. Jews had for centuries been persecuted, discriminated against, and killed all over Europe, including Great Britain. The periods and places in Europe which begrudgingly tolerated Jews make up the exception, not the rule.
But though a good beginning has been made in the areas occupied by the Jews, they believe that nearly all of Palestine's 6 million acres could be made to bear crops.
In the 1920s and 30s, the British greatly favored Zionists in Palestine, the European Jews who made up a small minority but believed in building a Jewish nation where a centuries-old Palestinian community already existed. Palestinian Arabs were treated much like the rest of the British Empire's colonized peoples, like inferior and dangerous savages at worst, and like nagging children at best. This led to the 1936 Palestinian uprising, sparked by a mass strike to protest the British and the Zionists. The revolt saw an uptick in violence, and the British sent a total of 100,000 troops to Palestine, more than the entire number of British troops in all of India at the time. After 3 years of violence and chaos, 262 British soldiers, 500 Jews, and 5,000 Arabs were killed. The renowned Palestinian historian Rashid Khalidi estimates that 10% of Palestinian men were either jailed, exiled, or killed, including most political leaders. At the very same time, the German Nazi regime was intensifying its genocidal campaign against European Jews. As a result, Jewish immigration to Palestine increased at an exponential rate.
As Germany and other nations increase their persecution, treat them as pariahs and outcasts, beat them down and trample on them, the Jews are turning more and more to their promised land, to the land which they were told once would be flowing with milk and honey.
But most European Jews did not escape. Most of them perished in the Holocaust. 6 million Jews were systematically murdered in the name of Hitler's deranged racism. When the Second World War ended, Zionist leaders in Palestine saw their mission as existential. For them, the mantra "never again" meant creating a strong and powerful state in Palestine with a Jewish majority. The only problem was that there were more than 1 million Palestinian Arabs already living there. Many, if not all, the Zionists at the time believed that these Palestinians would have to go. The result at the end of 1948 was worse than any Palestinian could ever have imagined. During the 1930s and 40s, Zionist intelligence systematically surveilled Palestinian villages and urban centers through informants and spies. By 1947, they knew that Palestinian resistance wouldn't stand a chance. Throughout 1947 and 48, 750,000 Palestinians were displaced as the Zionist militias systematically attacked and destroyed Palestinian villages and occupied Palestinian urban centers. Several Palestinian communities were subjected to mass killings and rape, such as the atrocities committed in Deir Yassin. Notably, this happened before any Arab army had declared war. When Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq did go to war, they lost. Hundreds of thousands of refugees fled to Gaza, the West Bank, and southern Lebanon. This is the Nakba, the Palestinian catastrophe.
وقف عمي
ليش وقفت يا فرحة؟
وقف
استني
راح استني
This is audio from the 2021 Jordanian film Farha, which tells the story of a Palestinian teenage girl whose village is brutally attacked by Zionist militias the day after she convinces her father to enroll her in school in the city. In this scene, she is forced to choose between fleeing in a car with her uncle or staying behind with her father. In my day, when Arabs and Jews lived peacefully together, way before the British bastards arrived in Palestine, and way before the Zionists arrived in our country, and way before the Shawashir, the troubles between the Arabs and the Jews began, many Jews came to Nabi Rubin. However, since the 1936 revolt, they've stopped coming, and I fear that if the present Shawashir keep escalating, we might not be able to celebrate the festival ourselves. This is a quote from your book, Mother of Strangers, where the 15-year-old protagonist Subhi's grandfather tries to explain why they as Muslims celebrate a Jewish prophet, Nabi Rubin, that's the prophet Reuben, every summer, and that Arabs and Jews once lived together in peace in Palestine. Suad, thank you for writing this important novel and welcome to the Kalam podcast.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much.
We're going to return to your novel in a little bit, but let me start by asking you about the event around which your novel pivots, Nakba, the catastrophe of 1948. David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, said of the 750,000 Palestinians displaced in the Nakba, he said, "The old will die and the young will forget." He expected the victims of the Nakba to forget about their own displacement. Clearly they haven't. Why is that?
Yeah, absolutely not. You know what is so funny, Edgar, is that the Israelis always brag about remembering 2,000 years ago or 3,000, and they are surprised. They give themselves the right to remember 3,000 years ago, but they don't allow the Palestinians to remember 75 years ago. They don't think that we are equal in any way, neither our memory is equal in any way. So apartheid goes even to our memories. But what I also want to tell you is normally when you go through a trauma, you need some peaceful time to forget that trauma. I mean, to treat the trauma, you have to be in a safe place, in a rehabilitation place, in a place that loves you, in circumstances that are quiet, that allow for rehabilitation. Unfortunately for us Palestinians, the 1948 Nakba, which I will explain a little bit more in a second, goes on every day. As I am talking to you right now, there are Israeli soldiers that are preventing people from entering Jerusalem. There are Israeli soldiers who are cutting olive trees. There are Israeli settlers who are invading people's homes. So how can we rehabilitate or forget when they continue the Nakba? So they're actually helping us not to forget.
How would you, as an author, as a Palestinian, as someone directly affected by the Nakba, how would you explain the meaning of it?
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me tell you that my father is from Jaffa, and my parents were in Palestine and they were kicked out of their home in 1948, and we became refugees in Jordan. So we are personally affected by the 1948. But 1948 is really is a turning point in the Middle East, which is also the creation of Israel. Now, for Israel to be created, to create a Jewish state, an only Jewish state in a Palestinian land, it only means one thing. It means ethnic cleansing. If you and I decide to have a Swedish country in France, and only for the Swedes, we have to kick out the French to be able to create a Swedish. This is what happens. People don't realize that if you really want to understand what is happening in Gaza today, you have to understand what happened in 1948. We were kicked out of our homes, our gardens, our schools, our clinics, our sea, our shops, our hospitals, our. Nobody ever asked, what did the creation of such a state over Palestine did to the Palestinians. The Israelis, to create their own state, they kicked 80% to 90% of the population. They destroyed 500 Palestinian villages. You know, I always say the following, Edgar. If there will ever be peace between Palestine and Israel, and I hope there will be, because there is no other way out for both of us, one thing that the Israelis have to do, like what they did in South Africa, acknowledge what they have done to the Palestinians. We need an apology from Israel for building a society over our society. So that's what the Nakba is, and that's why my latest story, Mother of Strangers, about Jaffa, we see the Palestinian society before the creation of Israel, and we see what happens to the Palestinian society. A city like Jaffa that had 120,000 people ended up with 3,000 people. The rest were kicked out.
And like you said, 500 Palestinian villages were not only cleansed of Palestinians, they were completely destroyed. And many Palestinian urban centers like Jaffa, like Haifa, places that at least Jaffa was not supposed to, according to the UN, be part of the Jewish state. They were also completely depopulated, like you said. But it wasn't only kicking people out and destroying property, it was also theft of property. Theft of houses and apartment buildings and things, objects. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, you know, in Arabic, we say that they took a furnished Palestine. It was furnished, like when you rent an apartment, it's furnished or unfurnished. We were kicked out of our homes while we were cooking. I remember my mother-in-law, who is also from Jaffa, saying that we made the coffee and we didn't have a chance to drink it. And I read also from the Israelis, soldiers, who talk about 1948. They say we came into homes and there were food and there were coffees. You know, the libraries alone, since I am a writer and I care about books, you know that there was a systematic robbery of Palestinian personal libraries in 1948 that are all sitting in the Hebrew University and the Israeli archive today. So this kind of dispossession at every level, and my book, Golda Slept Here, addresses this, the loss of a home, what it means, how it leaves you. You are foundationless all your life. And in Golda Slept Here, Edgar, I accompany Palestinians who are refugees in East Jerusalem, who own houses in West Jerusalem. People don't realize that these houses are gorgeous by all standards. You know, these villas that if you go today to West Jerusalem and see them, they are incredibly beautiful. And as a result, you are living in East Jerusalem, you are only 15 minutes away from your home. You walk there to West Jerusalem, to Al-Ba'a, for example, and you find an Israeli family living in your own home. We are refugees in our own homeland. And coming back to your point, Edgar, which is an important one about the properties. You know that the Israelis came up with something called absentees properties. And we are not absent. I am here in Ramallah. And many people are in East Jerusalem. They are away 15 minutes from their home. I am away half hour from Jaffa. But when it comes to our property, I am considered an absentee. It means that all the property of 1948 that became under the control of Israel was taken and put under Israeli control. But slowly, it was given to developers. It was sold to developers. It was given to settlers. So even though we are here, we are considered absent as far. I mean, it's difficult to even believe that such a law exists.
Yeah, it completely blows my mind to think that the international community did not respond at all.
Well, listen, I mean, the international community, we have to realize, is not only Europe and America. Even in America, in Sweden, in France, we have to make a distinction between the people and their governments.
Yeah.
Israel really is a colonial state, and we don't say that as a cliche. Okay? Now, all these governments, who supports Israel? Either the settler history of the Americans and the Canadians or the Australians, or the colonial history of Britain, France. Britain and France are the ones who divided the Arab world in Sykes-Picot. Britain was the one who gave a present, Lord Balfour gave a present to the Israelis, to the Jewish, saying that we will promise you a homeland in Palestine. And who the hell is he?
A bit of history here. After the First World War, Great Britain made three contradictory promises. The Balfour Declaration, signed by then Foreign Minister Lord Balfour, pledged a homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine. Great Britain had also promised King Hussein of Mecca a unified Arabian kingdom, which would include Palestine. And at the same time, it colluded with colonial France through the Sykes-Picot Agreement to divide the Middle East amongst themselves. These three contradictory promises have created chaos in the Middle East ever since.
Like Trump, exactly, who arrives to Jerusalem, he hardly knows where Jerusalem is and gives a present of East Jerusalem to the Israelis. France in Algiers, you think the French did less in Algiers than the Israelis are doing today? No. The Italians in Ethiopia, you think they did less? No. We see ourselves as a liberation movement trying to get rid of an occupation. And we see ourselves that we have made a concession by accepting a two-state solution because it only meant that my father's house in Jaffa, I will never get it back. And nobody notices that I have made that concession. This is what bugs me most.
So, returning a bit to the Nakba, could you speak a little bit about, the need to archive in the Palestinian historiographic tradition and in the Palestinian literary tradition, essentially reconstructing what Palestine was before the Nakba destroyed so much of it through literature and other writings? Can your book be seen as a part of that tradition?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. You know, I am an architect and a writer. Okay, let me say the following, Edgar. When I was a little girl in Jordan, my father really was always talking about the 420 villages that were destroyed, bulldozed by the Israelis. And as a little girl, I was always obsessed by this idea that a bulldozer comes and bulldozes everything. And as you know, I grew up in Jordan as a refugee between Jordan and Damascus and Lebanon. But anyway, I came to Palestine in 1981 to do a research on Palestinian village architecture. I started an organization called Riwaq for the protection of cultural heritage. If you arrive to Tel Aviv today, which used to be Lid Airport, and you go around, you hardly realize that this was an Arab country only 70 years ago. So for me, the protection of cultural heritage was an important mission to protect the identity of this land, but also to protect the people, the poorer people who are living in these areas. Every Palestinian is occupied by Palestine. We always talk about Palestine being occupied. Actually, what I suffer from most is Palestine occupying me. We have been occupied, and I wish to liberate myself from Palestine in the sense of just live an hour in my life when I don't think of myself as a Palestinian. So every Palestinian's act, whether a writer, a poet, a musician, unfortunately is one way or another connected to Palestine. So is my writing. Most of my novels, they started with Sharon and my mother-in-law. which took place during the invasion of Sharon to the city of Ramallah when Arafat was still alive, and the occupation of my mother-in-law, who was 91 years old and came and invaded my house, and having two occupations, one inside the house, one outside the house, drove me crazy. I ended up sitting and writing emails to friends every night, either about my mother-in-law in the house or about Sharon outside my house. You know, really writing became like kind of therapy for me. Just sit down and process, because there is a lot to process when you are living under occupation.
Yeah, it's very interesting to hear you speak about being occupied sort of mentally by the topic of Palestine, and I apologize for preventing your liberation for one more hour during the process of this conversation.
Here we will be talking about Gaza, or I will be looking at Al Jazeera, so it's not you.
Yeah.
It's
If we let's return to your novel and the quote that I read at the beginning of our conversation about this festival in Nabi Rubin that took place just south of Jaffa, if I'm not mistaken. And in that quote, Subhi, the protagonist's grandfather, describes, the good old days, which
Right.
I guess would be sort of the turn of the century, late 1800s, early 1900s, where he said that Jews and Arabs celebrated this thing together, and Christians as well, I assume. So can you describe how relations were between Jews and Arabs before, I guess during the late Ottoman period, before the Balfour Declaration, before the British came, before Zionism had firm roots in the region?
Nice question, really nice question. Okay, let me say the following about, again, expressions. For us Arabs, when you say the word Arab, it includes Jews. I mean, the distinction between Arab and Jews is a result also of the Zionist movement. Now everybody, you and I and everybody, talks about Arab and Jews. But actually, at the turn of the century, and until my father, who was in Jaffa, who had Jewish friends, Arab was an expression to include an ethnic group or a regional area. And then you could be an Arab Muslim, a Christian, or a Jew. In Palestine, there was a Jewish community, a Palestinian Jewish community. It's not an Ashkenazi Jews who came from Europe. No, they are local Palestinians who spoke Arabic like you and I, and they lived in major cities in Jerusalem, Safad, Tabariya, and Hebron. But there were also 3 purely Jewish villages in Palestine, like there were purely Christian villages in Palestine. I was born in Damascus, just right next to the Jewish quarter. And as you know, the Jews in Syria stayed in Syria. The Syrian government did not allow the Jews to migrate. So when I was a kid, we used to go to the Jewish quarter to buy vegetable and to buy things from there. And I was never told not to go there or not to buy from there. Ask the Iraqi Jews. The Iraqi Jews were the most educated, the richest in the country, and they really had a wonderful life there. I am not saying that there were no tension. Maybe I don't want to make it sound like paradise. Like now, maybe between Muslims and Christians in Palestine, there might be some tension every now and then, but we still live together. Jews were part of our culture. They were part of us. And you know how many of my age I know whose mother is Jewish, who live in Palestine, who I remember in the Palestinian negotiation team, there was a guy from Nablus. His mother was Jewish. I mean, we're not talking about centuries ago. In Morocco, the Jews were part and partial. In Tunisia, in Egypt, you must know, in Egypt. Unfortunately, when Zionism as an ideology came into the area, wanting to create a Jewish state over Palestine, the tension started. And the Israelis, I don't want to say things that are provocative, but also the Israelis asked many historians, attacked many places in Baghdad, attacked many places in Cairo to make the Jews leave.
This might sound controversial, but the Israeli historian Avi Shleim claims to have conclusively proven that more than one bombing of Jewish communities in Baghdad in the 50s was organized by Israeli intelligence as a false flag operation to convince the Iraqi Jewish community that they were unsafe and should emigrate to Israel. Similarly, in Egypt, the Lavon affair was a covert Israeli terrorist bombing campaign. This failed, however, and the operatives were caught and sentenced to death.
So, going back to the festivals, Robin was a fantastic festival, supposedly a religious festival, but in reality it was a cultural festival of the people of Jaffa. And in Palestine were many festivals like this, but Rubin was very famous because it included 50,000 people, people from Egypt, Kulthum, Asmahan, name it. There were hundreds of holy places, especially what we call a maqam, that were venerated by Muslim, Christians, and Jews. For example, Qubbat Rahel, Rachel tomb in Jerusalem. All Muslim, Christians, and Jews went to it. When Israel arrived, it made it only Jewish. Only Jewish. Now, Christians can't arrive, Muslims can't arrive to it. Sitna Maryam, for example, Virgin Mary is venerated by the Muslims. You know, St. George's celebrated by the Muslims.
Well, not to mention Nabi Isa, the Prophet Jesus.
Of course. Nabi Musa, you know, one of the festivals is called Moses Festival. And it is celebrated in Jerusalem. Because, you know, I always say I am partly Jewish. I am partly Christian. I am partly Muslim. I am partly of all the civilization that happened in my area. I am partly Italian and partly Greek. This is my culture. And it is an enriching culture. When you are partly all of these things, you are rich. So anyway, unfortunately, all of this is gone because of Zionism and because of the Jewish supremacy. And the minute, if you are Muslim, Christian, or Swedish, or Palestinian, name it, if you think you are better than others, then trouble starts.
So, your book is set in Jaffa, and a continuous theme throughout the book is the famous orange groves of Jaffa. And almost everyone in Jaffa at the time was connected to the orange business in one way or another. And in your book, there are many discussions and events that take place, you know, discussions about war, about marriage, adoption, different kinds of business are conducted, and it's all kind of happens beneath these orange trees. And I myself, I've never actually been to an orange grove, much less one in Jaffa. So could you describe as best as you can how this looks, how it smells, how it feels?
Yeah, you know, Jaffa oranges are a big memory of the people of Jaffa. My father always talked about the smell of April, you know, when it's all in blossom. Now, in the 30s, 20s, 30s, and 40s, really, Jaffa alone used to export around 30 million boxes of oranges to Europe and the world. So they made a lot of money. People became extremely rich to a point which made Jaffa a very cosmopolitan city. Business people, the rich from Beirut, Lebanon, Greece, Egypt, name it, came, but also the workers from Egypt, from Syria, from Yemen, Jordan. I'm gonna send you a beautiful photo. You have the sea. We all know how the sea looks like, but actually For Subhi, it was the first time he sits in the grove and overlooks the city. And it is a green carpet with orange dots, which is also similar to the dress of his beloved Shams. So really, Jaffa, before 1948, had 120,000 people, which was the biggest city. It had 7 cinemas. It had newspapers. So Jaffa really, in 3 days of bombardment from Tel Aviv, with no electricity, no water, exactly the system we see today in Gaza. I remember my mother-in-law said we didn't have flour to make bread. And of course, all the orange groves were left. The reason that, Edgar, you have never seen one, because they all died. The Israelis took over a little bit, but then eventually they left them and they were dried out, completely dried out. Jaffa oranges still alive in people's mind. Of course, unfortunately, today people think of it as an Israeli product, but in reality, it was the golden age of Palestine.
So, your father is from Jaffa.
Yes.
Have you ever been to Jaffa?
I have been to Jaffa actually many times, but I have never been to my father's house. The reason for that is a visit that my father did in 1968 after Israel occupied the rest of Palestine. He got a permit that allowed him to come from Jordan into the West Bank and then to Jaffa. And my father went to Jaffa, went to Manshiyah, the neighborhood which the story also takes place. And he was very happy because he found his house and there was a barber who was still there. So my father walks into the courtyard, knocks at the door, and an Israeli woman opens the door for him. And my father declares himself. He says, "My name is Muhammad Adib, and this is my house, and I'm coming to visit it. And if you allow me, there is my mom's photo in my bedroom. I would like to take it." And the Israeli woman tells him, "No, if you don't leave soon, I'm going to call the police." And my father said, "Why call the police? I am not threatening you. I'm not doing anything. I'm just telling you that I would like to see my house. And the only thing I want to take from that house is the photo of my mother's photo." And then she says no, and she slaps the door in his face. And so he stands there not knowing what to do. After all these 19 years of dreaming of visiting his house, he eventually gets there, but was not allowed to enter the house. And he was afraid of, obviously, that the police will arrive. So he left. He was supposed to stay in Jaffa or in Palestine for a week. We saw that my father came home the day after. He didn't stay. And I was 16 at the time, and I was very excited to see my father. So were my brothers and sisters. And it was the first time ever I see my father crying. You know, for a girl that age, I was like in total shock and didn't know what to say. We kept quiet, and my father got so depressed, went into his room for 2-3 days, and only my mother could come in. And that was very traumatic. Even now, when I talk about it, I get very emotional. Wow. It wasn't until 2018 I decided maybe I have the courage to go and face the reality. Unfortunately, Edgar, by the time I was ready to go see my father's house, we couldn't find it because Tel Aviv municipality has slowly demolished that whole area. And I came back, as you can imagine, very disappointed. But the taxi who brought me from Jaffa told me about his aunt, Shams. He says, "You have to come and meet my aunt Shams." So I went the day after. I met Shams, and that's where the story of my novel Mother-in-Law starts.
Yeah, Mother of Strangers.
I'm still obsessed with my mother-in-law,
Yeah.
Mother of Strangers.
It's certainly really moving to hear you speak about your father's horrifying experience of going back to his childhood home, and then you not locating it. But it's almost this kind of a novel within a novel, a kind of poetic justice that on the way in the taxi going back from this disappointing experience, you find this incredible story.
Yeah, absolutely. And we should all listen to our mothers and grandmothers and grandfathers and their stories, because really they are richer than any library we can go to. And the novel was based on what I heard from people.
Yeah. You just mentioned the sort of other protagonist of the book, Shams, who is 13 at the time of the Nakba, and she was separated from her family in 1948, and she basically had to take care of herself and her two younger sisters in completely horrific conditions. But eventually she was saved by a Jewish woman named Rifqa, which is the Arabized Rivka, who was married to an Egyptian Muslim man named Abed, and their son was named Mahmoud, and they were atheists and communists. This sounds completely, unthinkable today.
It is in the world.
So tell us a bit about this relationship and how common this was at the time for a Jew and a Muslim to be married in Palestine and be, atheist and communist.
This is how it used to be, actually. I tell you something, Edgar. The power of the novel is that it is really based on true events. In 1948, especially in Lid and in the villages around Jaffa, many people were kicked out of their villages, and they spent months under olive trees hoping to go back. Many families, like now in Gaza, they lost their children. Shams, actually, so she was really adopted by Mahmoud, who turns out to be a Jewish woman married, as you said, to an Egyptian. But this is what Palestine was like. And I wanted to remind people of that period and that possibility that still exists.
So, although everyone is quite worried in 1947, none of the characters in your book seem to be able to imagine what is actually coming. How significant is the shock factor of what the Nakba actually turned out to be?
It's very profound, very deep, because really, even when they left Edgar, they thought they're coming back. And I think what was so dramatic for the Palestinians is to realize that they're not coming back. And I think this realization is a very, very profound insecurity. Watch the Palestinians when they travel. If you have a Palestinian friend, they take 3 bags more than they need. Even if I am traveling for pleasure, I have this apprehension. I don't know why. It's just like it's a loss that never goes away.
So you wrote the novel Mother of Strangers in 2022, just barely a year before October 7th and the war in Gaza that is currently happening. Why did you write it? And can you perceive its meaning in light of what's happened since?
I wrote it thinking that 1948 is the worst moment we lived in our life, the watershed of Palestinian history. Little I realize that we are going to live a worse moment. I tell you why I think what's happening in Gaza is worse than 1948. The Israelis purposely created a self-sustained catastrophe. What they did is systematically destroying the infrastructure, water, electricity, fuel, everything, sewage So you are living in a place where you can't drink water. Then systematically destroyed all the institutions. 360 schools, 63 universities, 36 hospitals. I mean, you would ask, why would the Israelis invade all these hospitals? They are fighting the wounded, which means every single person in family in Gaza has suffered not only losing their school, their shop, their everything, but they are left with a place that is inhabitable. So the effect of this genocide is going to last for decades. So when I wrote Mother of Strangers, really I never thought that we will live the Gaza, because I never thought the Israelis can be that wicked. That wicked.
Suad Al-Amiry, thank you so much for being the first guest on the Kalam podcast. I really, really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me.
Thank you, Edgar, for having this program at this time. It's very important that people hear our voices, and thank you for inviting me, and for being the first or the last, but thank you so much.
Inshallah, not the last. Thank you very much. Okay, take care. That was the award-winning author and architect Suad Al-Amiry, and the first episode of the Kalam podcast on the Nakba. I hope you enjoyed it. I can't recommend Suad's captivating 2022 novel Mother of Strangers enough, of which we spoke about extensively in the episode, as well as the other novels we mentioned, Sharon and My Mother-in-Law, and Golda Slept Here. Next week, we're going to look at the Nakba again, but from another perspective. During my conversation with Suad and throughout my reading on 1948, I find myself puzzled as to how the early Zionists could go through with something like this, and how Israelis today commemorate the Nakba as their own Independence Day. That's why I've invited the renowned Israeli journalist and political dissident Gideon Levy on the show. Next week, Gideon and I will do our best to explain the Israeli psyche and give you an idea of who the people who perpetrated the Nakba were. That's next time on the Kalam podcast. Kalam was written and hosted by me, Edgar Mannheimer. Poetry reading in Arabic was done by Khulud Saghir. Research and production by Sam Kol Samra, and sound design by Arthur Mannheimer.